Well, let's dive in. So, Rich Diviney, he's a retired Navy SEAL commander. In January of 2021, Rich released his first book, The Attributes, the 25 Hidden Drivers of Optimal Performance. So let's dive in. First, we want to hear more about your experience as being a Navy SEAL.
Oh, okay. Well, gosh, so many.
Where do I
I
start?
Where do I start? I guess I could start in the '90s when I like the first Gulf War when I actually realized or learned what Navy SEALs were. I had no clue what they were because I wanted to be a pilot. I wanted to be a Navy pilot, but I kind of learned what they were and began to read about them quite a bit, and became enamored because of a couple things. First of all, it seemed like they were in all environments. They were everywhere. They were in the air. I mean, obviously sea, air, land, but they were in the
Yeah.
jungle and the Arctic, all that stuff, and they seemed pretty cool. But I also love this idea that they were a waterborne force. I mean, they were from the water. I loved the ocean. I love the ocean. I love the water. I'm very comfortable in the water, no matter what it is. And this idea that they made this hostile refuge, this hostile place, because the ocean is hostile to human beings, obviously, right?
Mhm.
No oxygen, cold, bone crushing temperatures. But the fact that they made this place their refuge was kind of cool to me because the saying that we had in the teams was, "Hey, whenever you're in trouble, go to the ocean, go to the water, because the enemy will be they won't be brave enough or dumb enough to follow you there, right?" And so the fact that we ran to this hostile place was cool. And so I joined up in '96 after graduating college. I went to SEAL training, made it through, which was cool.
Yeah.
And
Um,
hard, which I've
Hard,
heard.
yeah.
Very
I
hard.
mean,
Started
yeah.
with 160, I think 65 students, and we graduated 38 of us, which is normal.
Wow.
That's normal numbers. It's about an 89, 90% attrition. And then began my career in the '90s when there was really nothing going on, and of course 9/11 happened, and our lives became quite kinetic, which was interesting. I had just met my wife. We'd just gotten married,
Wow.
and in fact, when I proposed to her, I said, "Hey," she didn't really know about SEALs either, but I said, "Hey, this it's scheduled deployments, it's training, and this and that, but it's fairly predictable." Of course, 9/11 happened, and everything became unpredictable. But ended up deploying quite a bit. I mean, deployed 13 plus times to Iraq and Afghanistan, and then other places, and went through a career where I was, an officer in charge of a troop, and then of course a team. I was in charge of training and selection for a specialized team, which was really where the impetus of the ideas of the book came. I started thinking about it, but I was in the teams until December 31st, 2016 was my last day in the Navy, and then retired and have been working in the leadership performance space, and of course wrote the book. But yeah, I mean, we can think about. I mean, I'll pepper in specific stories. There's some stories I can't tell,
Yeah.
but obviously it's that lifestyle is interesting because it's a lifestyle where you get very used to being in stress, challenge, uncertainty. So much so that it becomes normal to you. And I think my wife and I used to joke because at one point we were this was actually a couple of years ago. We were at a dinner with some folks, and they weren't military or anything. And we were having a conversation. At one point, it kind of reminded me. I said, "Oh yeah, that this reminds me of a time I was jumping out of an airplane. It was 22,000 feet and it was freezing." And I began telling the story. And of course, my wife's kind of like, "Yeah, if she's heard the story a
No
million
big
times."
deal.
But all the jaws were dropping open because they're like, "What the hell are you talking about? That's so weird." But it's so normal, so you're in this very extraordinary situation, and it becomes fairly normal, which you
Yeah.
you realize only afterwards sometimes.
And navigating a family through that. How
Yeah,
was that? How did your wife and your kids handle that?
it was tough. Without mincing words, we, again, I think I think a large part of success in that type of life, in really any life that requires so much of you, is that you are clear on your identity and how you prioritize your identity, right? So for me, it was always husband, father, Navy SEAL. Now, the Navy has something to say about that, and the Navy sometimes says, "Nope, we're the priority. That's why you deploy." So
Yeah.
sometimes the job forces you to. But I think if you stay in that mentality, you at least stay grounded. My wife and I stayed grounded, and then you try to work through it. My sons, my eldest had trouble. He always had trouble with me leaving since the time he was 2 years old. He had trouble with me leaving,
Yeah.
And so we had to really help him through it and
Sure.
try to get help for him. My youngest, he was 2 years younger, but he was a little bit less affected. But they are teenagers now, and I'm home now, and it's nice. We're all very grateful that as they're in their teen years, Dad is home all the time, which is cool. But yeah, it's hard. It's the downfall of many military relationships. On the plus side, though, it makes you appreciate your relationships much more. I mean, I remember coming home from deployment. There's the feeling of coming home from deployment that can only be described as the feeling that we used to get as kids on Christmas Eve. That's
Yes.
what it feels like. And
I
so
can only imagine.
when you feel that way about your family and about your wife and all, I mean, you really appreciate each other. So that if you do it right, it helps. So
I love
Yeah,
that.
I love that too. Well, in the book, you talk about discipline and self-discipline.
yeah.
So can you talk about this and the difference between the two?
Yes, that was a chapter I had to be very introspective while writing. And I had to really admit my vulnerabilities. And the reason why I had to is because when I started to explore discipline holistically, this idea of self discipline kept on coming up. And discipline holistically is this idea: can you set and march toward and achieve kind of the long term goals, right? Are you disciplined enough to do that? Which I am. I've done that my whole life, right? At the same time, I'm extraordinarily unself disciplined. I don't. It's hard for me to eat the right thing every day and work out every day. And I mean, it just self discipline is tough for me. It always has been. And so I had to reconcile with myself on the fact that there was a difference here, and then begin to index it against kind of what I saw and what we see in life. Right? We have seen people who are extraordinarily self-disciplined. They are, for example, in superior shape, right? They do things, they eat the right thing, and they're working out every day and all this stuff, but they can't get their lives together, right? They can't achieve stuff. And we've seen the opposite. We've seen people who are extraordinarily unself-disciplined. They're partying like the Guns N' Roses guys who achieve great things, right? They're able to make these long-term goals. So the difference is self-discipline is the ability to control and be disciplined about those things um, that the external world has no say in, right? In other words, we could decide to eat right and work out. Doesn't matter what the external world is doing; it's our decision. If I decide that and I go to the Vegas buffet, the buffet is not going to throw itself at me, right? It's all on me. And that's where self-discipline really helps, and your ability to kind of establish routine and be disciplined that way. Discipline holistically, again, when you're achieving long-term goals, it's the external world does have a say. If you want to be a Navy SEAL, if you want to be an author, if you want to be a podcaster, if you want to be a surgeon, then the external world has a say in that, which means it takes a whole different set of discipline. It actually takes a lot more adaptability. And I think one of the issues that highly self-disciplined people run into is the fact that they oftentimes require a very routinized existence. I mean, they plan, they prepare. This has to happen. I do this at this time. I do this. Well, any of us who've achieved long-term goals that the external world has a say in knows that nothing ever goes as planned. You actually have to, in many cases, in many moments, break from your routine so that you may actually do something different. And so this is the I think the problem. Ideally, obviously, it's a balance of both. The most successful people have a balance of both. But being too skewed in one area or another might have issues. So that's how I would break those two down.
I think
Yeah.
being too rigid, like not being able to adapt,
Right.
can be a really big problem for people who are self-disciplined because they get thrown off pretty easily. I've noticed that.
Yeah. So it affects too much self-discipline. Sometimes affects adaptability, which
Yeah.
then therefore affects overall discipline. So
Yeah.
And personality.
yes.
Let's talk about peak performance and optimal performance and why you feel optimal performance is better.
Okay, great. Again, I think there's nothing wrong with peak performance.
Yeah.
But peak, and people are chasing peak performance. How can I peak often and as much as possible? I wouldn't say the problem. What we have to recognize is that peak is simply an apex. That's what it
Right.
is. And it's an apex from which you can only come down. And peak has to be usually prepared for and planned and scheduled. The athlete, whether Olympic or NFL football player, plans and prepares so that they may peak for their event for 3 hours on Sunday or for the 40 seconds of their track run. It's a fairly unrealistic model to place upon life, right? And so I kind of always say, well, Navy SEALs are optimal performers, and optimal performance is how can I do the very best I can in the moment, whatever the best looks like in the moment. Okay, sometimes it could look like peak. I mean, sometimes that's great. Everything's flowy, it's clicking, but sometimes it's like, hey, all I got today or all I got right now is I can take one step at a time.
Right.
That is still performing optimally. That's doing the best you can.
Right.
So it helps us really pat ourselves on the back and reward ourselves for making it through, for grinding it out, even when it's dirty, ugly, muddy, and gritty. We're taking that step and we're performing optimally. But I think it also helps us recognize and appreciate and operate in a way that's much more healthy and responsible in terms of our energy modulation, right? I don't need to be peaking when I'm driving to the grocery store, okay? I can be modulating my energy so that in the moments where peak is required, I'm ready to peak. And this is exactly what SEALs do. I was working out with a friend of mine. He was a trainer. I was pushing one of the sleds with weights, right? And he was timing me because he was putting me through a program. And I asked him, I said, what are you timing when I push this sled? And he said, well, I'm timing how explosive you are when you start pushing and then how long it takes you to finish. And I said, well, what are you finding? He said, well, what you're doing, what I'm seeing you do is when you come out of the gate, you're at the same pace as you are all the way through. So you basically maintain the same pace from the time you start pushing all the way to the end. I said, what do you do? He's like, I do the opposite. I explode out and then I slowly slow down as I go. And he had trained a bunch of SEALs. So I said, what do you typically see SEALs do? He said, I typically see SEALs do what you do. And it made me think it's the difference between anaerobic and aerobic, right? Mm-hmm. And I think SEALs, when we go through training, what you realize when you go through that type of kind of horrible training for so long, you recognize that you prepare your body constantly for an end that you never know when it's going to come, right? So you're always approaching life as, hey, I don't know when this is going to end. So I'm going to do my best right now. Whatever the environment requires, I'm going to put my best into it. But I'm going to modulate that based on what I see. I'm not going to overdo it if I don't need to overdo it, so that when I need to overdo it, I can overdo it. But also when I need to recover, I can recover. So I think optimal performance allows us to play with that energy modulation in a much more healthy and responsible way.
Yeah, I like that. That's true. That's a really good. I've never really heard anyone talk about that before, but it makes so much sense.
Yeah, it's definitely the way I operate. And I've recognized that it's again, sometimes I don't peak the way I want to peak, but at the same time, I approach everything with hey, I'm gonna start. You'll very rarely see guys who are SEALs come out of the gate like super strong, super fast, unless it's required in the moment, right? But you'll usually see them kind of pace themselves as they move in, right? Because we're always thinking about the long haul, always, and life is a long haul. That's what it is, and so we need to think about it that way.
And less pressure, I feel like, if you're always trying to peak, that's a lot of pressure. Mm-hmm. So
and that has its own health.
Yes. Consequences.
Yeah, consequences. There's the word, consequences. Right.
Well, talk to us about your 80-20 rule.
Mm-hmm. So 80-20, 80-20 can actually, it's a good segue from optimal performance, because what 80-20 allows us to do is it allows us to understand that progress and success requires action. And action, you'll never get 100% certainty when you're moving towards something, when you're trying to accomplish something, which means you have to understand what percentages of certainty you are comfortable with, and then make a decision to move forward. 80-20 is really just a kind of used to describe, hey, like we'd when we look at a target we were trying to affect, right? You're going to collect as much intelligence about that target as you possibly can. you're never going to get 100% intelligence, right? So we used to say, well, just get 80%, 20% will just be uncertain. We'll just go and check it out. And I think that's another way you can kind of approach life and approach movement and action, is that, hey, don't wait for the perfect scenario. Don't wait for all of the information, because first of all, you're never going to get it. And second of all, more importantly, some of that very information that you're looking for, you're actually not going to even see until you move forward on your path, right? This is the rock climber kind of climbing up the mountain, right? The peak, as they're climbing, the peak is the outcome, but they're going to move down, up and down, inside a valley. They're going to lose sight of that peak. And as they come over certain areas, they may in fact see trails and pathways that they didn't see from the ground, from their start point. So in order to even see some of the best pathways, we actually need to move forward on a pathway, which means don't wait for all the answers. Get as much as you can and then move forward.
Yeah, getting uncomfortable with the unknown, right?
Yeah.
And that's where confidence comes in too, right? And we got to train ourselves and put ourselves in uncomfortable situations to get more comfortable with that, which is leading into my next thing that you talk about, that autonomic set point, and really working on that. Can you talk more about that?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. The autonomic set point really gets into kind of our courage and our fear, right? And this idea that when when fear begins to bubble up, we get a signal from our amygdala, the threat indicator in our brain, and that amygdala, as it's getting kind of tickled, can kind of go up into a full blown response, which in the extreme cases is an amygdala overload or amygdala hijack, right? Where basically it's, because of our response, our frontal lobe is kind of going offline, and we're just acting without thinking in a survival setting, right? In survival mode. So the idea is the autonomic set point starts to speak to when our amygdala starts to get tickled, right? When we start to get that fear
Yes.
setting in, when that fight or flight response begins to start coming into our brain. For some people, their autonomic set point is high, right? So if we say hey, boiling point is the average, right? Some people, they don't boil over until like 230 degrees, right? Which means it takes a lot for them to even start feeling threatened. Okay, this
Right.
could be dangerous if it's too high, right? I love the movie uh, about the climber, Free Solo, right?
Mhm.
Alex Honnold. And when you watch that movie, they look at his brain. It's like that guy's fear response is like really muted. I mean, he doesn't get afraid very easily, so
Yeah.
his autonomic set point is pretty high.
Hmm.
There are other people whose autonomic set point is lower. It's like 190, which means they get freaked out pretty easily. And
Right.
again, there's nothing wrong with this. It's just kind of where you sit on the scale. But I think to understand where we sit on the scale starts to help us deconstruct our behavior a little bit and help us understand how we'll behave and why we behave in certain situations. So that's kind of that idea of understanding where your set point might be. And if you're
Yeah.
happy with that, then then go with it. If you're not, you can practice getting scared.
What are some ways like our listeners could practice increasing their autonomic set point? Like, what do we need to do to increase that? Because like fear is a big thing. It stops people from doing things. So just kind of talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't think you can do it holistically. In other words, you're not going to be able to do things that make you less afraid of everything.
Right.
Okay. You have to actually be contextual in what you're practicing. And then you get into what's called stress inoculation, right?
Mhm.
And the only way to do that, unfortunately, is to just do what you fear as
Yeah.
much as possible, right? So my example is that, for me, it's like I hate heights. And so skydiving was always a challenge for me because you're pretty high. Um, if I were to go on some of our jump trips, we'd show up, and in 5 days we'd do like 50 jumps, which means you're jumping like 10 times a day. That is a lot of skydiving.
Yeah.
So by day two, I wasn't really nervous anymore. You're just going up and doing it because you're just constantly inoculating yourself. You're going through those motions to get you through that event. I used to also climb on our obstacle course. I used to climb the high obstacles and sit on top of them, right? Just to kind of breathe in that fear. And then I do that for a week or so, and by the time I get to the top, I wouldn't feel it anymore. It'd be muted. So we can inoculate our fear a little bit. In other words, bring up our autonomic response in certain contexts by doing more of that. A more practical example that's not Navy SEAL would be public speaking.
Right.
I did not like public speaking when I was getting out of the Navy. And so I said to myself, well, maybe I should find a job where I do more of it, because I thought it would be beneficial for me down the road. So I got a job where I was public speaking, and I hated the first few. I mean, as I was doing it, the first few months, it was like, oh my gosh, this
Oh,
again.
painful.
And I'd be nervous and all that,
Oh, yeah.
and I just did it, and I did it and did it. And so now I'm at the position where when I have to give a talk, I'm not nervous anymore. I'm inoculated, right? I can more focus on, okay, I'm more nervous now that I'm going to forget like something I'm supposed to say that I really want to say than I am about being in front of people, right? So, so we can inoculate ourselves that way.
I love it.
That's such a good example, because I think that's like one of the biggest fears in the world is public.
Yeah. I think the Seinfeld joked. It's like people fear public speaking more than they do death, which means the person who is speaking at the person at a funeral would rather be in the casket than giving the eulogy, right? So that was his big joke, which is true. Yeah, it came out that way.
Oh gosh, it's so true though, that public speaking. I feel you on that one, but it does get easier.
It does. Yeah, the more you do it.
Yeah.
What about being a leader? So, you talk about being a leader and the main behaviors leaders should strive to be. So can you give us some pointers on that?
Yes, being a leader. Well, first of all, we cannot conflate being in charge with being a leader. All right, they're not the same thing. One is a noun and one is a verb. Leadership is a behavior. You're not allowed to self-designate. You can't call yourself a leader, right? Because that's like calling yourself good looking or funny.
Right.
Other people decide whether or not you're good looking or funny, as do other people decide whether or not they choose to follow you. Okay.
Yeah.
Leadership, if you are a leader, that means people have chosen to see you as one and chosen to follow you. And that's done based on the way you behave towards them. So the attributes I describe in the book, the leadership attributes, are basically the attributes that kind of holistically lead people to say, that's someone I want to follow. That's someone I look to as a leader. And I know this because, in doing the leadership work since retirement, or kind of around the country, around the world, we used to ask audiences, what do great leaders do? And we used to generate lists as they gave us behaviors. And these 5 attributes always made the list. And by the way, it was interesting. The list was always the same. It was always the same stuff, right? Regardless of where you are in the country, where you were in the world, even generational differences. I mean, whether it's millennials or baby boomers, the list was always the same things. And these 5 things were always on it, right? And so things like empathy, selflessness, accountability, authenticity, decisiveness, those were always things that people say, hey, when someone behaves this way, I begin to look at them as a leader. I designate them. And so I always joke, if anybody ever comes to you and says, hey, I am your leader, run away, because that's not the way it works, right? Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more detail of the attributes, like about empathy, in case listeners don't know what that means, or can you just go in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, I mean, so the first level of detail would be to separate them from skills, and this is the work I really did originally. And the idea when we look at performance, and I was looking at performance in the particular job I was in the SEALs, I had to recognize, or at least remember, that performance comes in different forms.
Yeah.
And really make this distinction between skills and attributes. And so skills are not inherent to our nature, right? We learn them. We're not born with the ability to throw a ball or ride a bike or drive a car. We learn those things. We're taught those things. Skills direct our behavior in known and specific environments. So here's how and when to throw a ball or ride a bike. And then because they're very visible and tangible and kind of didactic that way, they are easy to assess, measure, and test. You can see how well anybody does any one of those things. That's why you can score them. You can put stats around them. You can put them on a resume. All right. This is why people, when they're building teams or hiring, they often get seduced by skills, because you can see them. They're in front of your face. Right. Sales numbers, right? What skills don't tell us is how people are going to show up in stress, challenge, and uncertainty, because in an unknown, uncertain environment, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to apply a known skill. This is where we lean on our attributes. Attributes, on the other hand, are more innate, okay? All of us are born with levels of patience, situation awareness, adaptability, resilience. Now, certainly they develop over time and experience, but we can see levels of this stuff in small children. Um, Attributes, they don't dictate behavior, they inform behavior, right? So our levels, or say my son's levels of adaptability and resilience, for example, informed the way he showed up when he was learning how to ride a bike for the very first time, learning that skill. And he was falling off a dozen times. Okay, so they inform how we're going to show up to a situation. And then because they're kind of hidden in the background, they're very difficult to assess, measure, and test. They're very difficult to see and score and identify. You can't necessarily sit across the table from a person in an interview for a job and assess their levels of adaptability or patience or situation awareness. They show up the most visibly and viscerally during times of stress, challenge, uncertainty, which is what made my laboratory of SEAL training so cool, because that's all. I mean, SEAL training is all throwing people into stress, challenge, uncertainty. That's all it is.
Seriously.
But as regular people, not SEALs, right? We can all kind of look at how we operate and how we have operated in times of challenge, stress, and uncertainty, and begin to autopsy our levels of each attribute. Okay. Now, the good news is that all of us have all of the attributes. The difference in each one of us is the levels to which we have each, right? So, for example, if we take adaptability, 10 being high, 1 being low, I'm about a level 8. I would say I'm about a level 8 on adaptability. What does that mean? That means when the environment changes around me outside of my control, it's fairly easy for me to go with the flow and roll with it. Okay, I can adapt pretty quickly. Someone else might be a level 3, which means when the same thing happens to them, it's very difficult for them to do it, right? They're still adaptable. They'll get there probably. But it's difficult for them to do so, right? So if we were to take all the attributes and put them on a wall like dimmer switches and line them all of our dimmer switches would be at different positions.
Right.
And our lines would look different. There's no judgment in that, by the way. That'd be like judging our hair color. It's just how we show up, okay? So how we show up, it starts to say, okay, this is why and how I behave the way I do. And then if you want to develop an attribute they're low on, you can do that too. You just can't do it the same way you can do a skill, right? So the quick back of the envelope test to determine whether or not it's a skill or an attribute, because they get conflated all the time, is to ask the question, can I teach it or can it be taught? If the answer is yes, then it's likely a skill. If the answer is no, it's likely an attribute. The example would be, Krystal, you and Becky, you say, Rich, we want to learn how to shoot a pistol and hit a target every time, right? Hit a bullseye every time. Well, I could take both of you out to the range and teach you how to do that within about 2 hours, right? That is a skill.
Yeah.
Or you could say, hey, Rich, we want to learn how to be more patient or more adaptable. I can't teach you how to do that, right? So if you want to develop an attribute, it takes self-motivation, takes self-direction, and it takes a willingness for the individual to step into discomfort, uncertainty, and challenge to tease and develop that attribute. If you are impatient and you want to develop your patience, you must go seek environments that test your patience, and therefore you develop it, right? So I don't know what that looks like. That could be, I don't know, standing in the longest line at the grocery store, or deliberately driving in traffic, or having kids. That's a great one, right? So
Big one. Yeah.
big one. But check. Yeah. So that's a kind of a breakdown between the attributes and skills.
Don't you think that you have to also really be willing to look within yourself, to say, like, let's say someone does not have a lot of empathy. And I think that's not a good thing, if someone doesn't have a lot of empathy.
Right.
And I think in order to increase that, which can happen, you have to be able to look inside yourself first and say, I don't have a lot of empathy, but look at someone maybe who does, and maybe admire that in them. And then that is something you can actually work towards. Because I know I have changed my personality over years, just with age, between being in my 20s and 40s. But, because I wanted to be nicer, or I wanted to be, more kind, whatever, just seeing it and noticing something I didn't like within myself, and making a note, to myself to stop doing it and to be more like the thing that I did like, which just empathy is just a good example. So I think that you have to really look within yourself to do that.
You're absolutely right, and that really was the goal for the book. I mean, I wanted to write a book that was not about Navy SEALs, right? Because there's enough SEAL books out there. I wanted to write a book that was really about the reader. And
Mhm.
so when the hope is when you read the book, you begin to start thinking about yourself and think about how you show up with for these attributes, where your levels might be, and then asking yourself, okay, which ones am I lower on, and as such, which ones do I want to develop? Because again, you don't need to develop all the attributes you're low on, right? What
Right.
I always say is like we're all like automobiles, okay? So we're all cars, but some of us are Ferraris and some of us are SUVs and some of us are Jeeps. Okay, again, no judgment because the Ferrari can do things the Jeep can't do,
Right.
and the Jeep can
Right.
do things the Ferrari can't do. But it behooves us to kind of lift our hood and figure out what we actually are for a couple of reasons. First of all, we may be a Jeep that's trying to run on a Ferrari track. Okay,
Yeah.
and again, that's okay too, because if we choose to do that, we choose to do that. But just knowing we're a Jeep trying to run a Ferrari track will help us identify those things that we have to do so that we can better run on that track. Or they say, you know what, I'm a Jeep and I've been trying to run on this Ferrari track this whole time. No wonder I'm unhappy. I want to go find a Jeep track I can run on, right? Or vice versa. So I think understanding where we fall on these attributes uh, tells us what kind of engine we have. It tells us how we're doing in the context of our current pathway or goal, and then identifies those things that we may want to develop. Right? Again, certain pathways don't need certain attributes. I kind of joke that like the stand-up comic doesn't need a lot of empathy. Okay, in fact, too much empathy could be detrimental to a stand-up comic's career, right? Because how can you find funny at a funeral if you're too empathetic? So so if you're low on empathy and you're a stand-up comic, you don't necessarily need to work on your empathy, but there might be other things you want to work on. I think empathy is a great example, Becky, because I never considered myself that empathetic of a person, right? My wife, on the other hand, is one of the most empathetic people on the planet, right? So I saw her and I saw how she related to people and she relates to people,
Mhm.
and in seeing that, I said, well, I want to model that
Yes.
Oh,
because
yeah.
I can understand like the curiosity that she has with other people makes her just a richer, fuller human being when she's deliberately asking questions of people that she cares about. Where I was like, I don't care, you know. But now
Yeah.
that I've been able to proactively affect my curiosity and my empathy, I've found some more richness and fullness in that, right? So I think those are the types of decisions that we can make once we introspect.
I think that what I've noticed with just empathy in particular is that
Yeah.
people in relationships, one tends to be much more empathetic than the other. Like it's almost like
Mhm.
the law of attraction. It's
Yeah,
Yeah.
you
yeah,
have
I see
two
that too, I feel.
real empathetic people together most of the time. It's usually like kind of the opposite
well,
sometimes.
and I think this is the key to high performing teams. I talk about high performing teams, and on a high performing team, a lot of times you have the polarities of
Mhm.
the attributes because they start to mesh together like a zipper. And so empathy is one of those. I joke about my wife and I. I'm typically someone with high patience. I'm a patient person. My wife is highly impatient, right? Well, that's worked. That mesh has worked beautifully as we've been
Right.
married for 20 years and had kids, right? Because when the situation requires patience, I step up and take lead. When the situation requires impatience, she steps up and takes lead, right?
Yes.
And so you can if you have the right polarities, you can actually play off of each other in a very very cool, high performing way. For some of them, obviously, there are some that most of us probably want a little bit more of. I mean, resilience is good for everybody on a team to have, and
Yeah.
I would even say courage and adaptability. Most of the grit ones are probably good for most people to have. But yeah, you can find some of the best combinations by seeing that how these attributes kind of mesh together, the polarities at least.
Yeah, I like how you talked about decisiveness too, one of that attribute of being a leader, making decisions, and leaders often know that these decisions don't have to be forever, but they make a decision, right? I
Yeah.
feel like so many people, we're all guilty of it, are slow to make decisions, and it can really hinder goals and hinder. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, the idea is that there's a difference in when you make a decision, there's a difference in it being final or permanent.
Right.
Okay. And decisiveness speaks to one's ability to make a decision, kind of going with the 80-20 rule, to absorb all of the relevant information that's available at the time to such a degree that you can make a responsible decision. And when you do, it's final, which means you move forward based on that decision. Now, it might not be permanent. This is where accountability kind of buttresses decision or decisiveness, because as you move forward on the decision, you take accountability for that. You say, okay, is this working or is this not working? I'm being accountable for the fact that it's not working. So now I'm going to change. I'm going to make a new decision. I'm going to change my path. So decisiveness is the ability to make a decision effectively, efficiently, and fairly quickly, because we all know some of those leaders or people that just make long, protracted decisions or take a lot of time.
Yeah.
It's not a very enduring leadership quality, right? So,
Right.
so I think there's the timestamp on this is part of that whole decisiveness attribute. Whereas there are some people who make decisions way too rapidly, and they're almost reckless, right? Because they haven't taken in enough information. So there's a sweet spot there. Yeah, maybe. Yeah, so there's
I love
a
it.
sweet spot there that we have to kind of look for, where we say, okay, I'm gonna take the information I have. I'm gonna take the time that I need, but I'm not gonna take too much time. I'm gonna make a decision, take accountability for it, see how it goes, and make a different one if need be.
Yeah. And the accountability too. I love that. Like oftentimes we do see leaders, they take ownership, right? Can you talk a little bit about accountability?
Yeah, I don't think. I mean, it's very rare for people to be designated as a leader and they constantly play the blame game. Okay, now
Mhm.
people can be in charge and play the blame game, but it's rare that people who are looked at as leaders are blaming other people, right?
Right.
It's typically, hey, I got this. I'm responsible. And again, I think the best leaders do what I say. Kind of call you delegate responsibility, but keep accountability, right? So in other words, you allow your people to get some responsibility. You give them leash, right? But if they screw up, it's
Mhm.
on you, and you accept that, right? I mean,
Mhm.
that's your job to kind of coach them and help them. And so I think that's kind of a leadership must, is to be able to do that. The other thing I think accountability does, again, human beings like control.
Yeah.
We do. Well,
Mhm.
I think what a lot of people don't recognize about accountability, because they fear it sometimes, is that when you take accountability, you immediately take control, right?
Mhm.
Versus when you blame, you're ceding control. You're basically saying, hey, there's nothing I can do about this because it's
Right.
someone else's fault, right? So you're ceding almost every avenue of control, improvement, growth, all that stuff. Versus if you take accountability, you suddenly take control, even if for some things like, well, I mean, in reality, I'm almost not accountable for it because it was a ton of other things. But even the exercise to say, okay, wait a second, how am I accountable, right? It gives you a portion of control in terms of ability to examine the event, the act, the moment, to affect some growth, right? So it's a decision. I mean, obviously, there are some things that happen to us that are absolutely not our fault, right? So
Right.
so I'm not recommending take accountability for everything, right?
Yeah.
But but certainly in those contexts where we can say, hey, let me ask myself where I can hold myself accountable. What was my role in this? I think those are very empowering, effective questions.
Yeah. And being authentic too. I loved how you talk about being, I mean, that's so true. There's only one
Yeah.
being authentic. And I love that. And most leaders they're very authentic. They're unapologetically themselves.
Well, we know. I mean, I think authenticity. I don't rank order any of these attributes.
Yeah.
But if I were to be forced to pick, I think the most important one for trust and leadership, it's authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Because authenticity builds trust, and
Right.
we can very easily see inauthenticity in other people, right? When we have someone who's in charge and they are one way with the people above them and they're another way with the people below them, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't bode well for leadership, right? When if you see people who are the same way, and in the book I tell a story about a commanding officer who I met. He was just taking command. According in the military, you change command every couple of years, and so as a member of a command, you often get a new CO, in the middle of while you're there. And so this new CO took over, and I remember meeting him for the first time, and he shook my hand grumpily, right, and kind of immediately started going in on me on some gear, some dive gear, some things like that we hadn't been using. And I was fairly new to the command, so I didn't really have many answers other than what other people told me, right? So I was really kind of just regurgitating what I'd been told about why we weren't using it, and he was really kind of in on me on this. And I remember leaving that 2-minute conversation, be like, oh my gosh, this is going to be a tough 2 years with this guy. But what I realized over the course of a week or two was that this guy was like that with everybody. You know, he was grumpy and he asked the hard questions, whether it was someone above him, below him, whether he was at PT, whether he was at Chow, whether he was at his office. He was always the same. And as soon as I realized that, I recognized an ability to work with that, right? And in fact, he was a really great leader because he did ask the tough questions. They were always really good ones. They were hard ones, but they were good ones. And I actually enjoyed working for him. So much so that it was a few years later, I rolled up to a job, a task force overseas, and I realized as soon as I got in there that the guy I was going to be working for was him. And
Wow.
I met him, and he shook my hand grumpily, right, and basically said, "Hey, yeah, glad you're here. There's a stack of work on your desk that needed to be done yesterday," right? I mean, in his grumpy manner, and I felt comforted, right? I was like, "Oh, okay, I got this, right? I know this guy, right? I know exactly what he expects, right? So authenticity, even if you're a little bit grumpy, can actually bring trust and
It's true.
security, which is good and interesting.
Being
I
yourself.
have to say something, going back real quick to accountability. I have found there is nothing more attractive in a person in
Mhm.
general, whether it's a friend or partner, than someone who can take accountability for
Mhm.
something
Yeah,
they've done wrong or whatever.
Sorry, or
Like
yeah.
saying, I see that I did this, that was my fault, or
yeah,
whatever, you know, like
Mhm.
I think that is so much more attractive than someone who cannot ever just say that, yeah, you know what, I screwed up or whatever.
yeah. Well,
Mhm.
I think Becky, I think that's that feeling is probably ubiquitous. I mean, that's a
Yeah,
human thing, right? We are not attracted to people who we can't trust, and if we can't
right.
trust someone to take accountability, and we fear that they maybe even blame us,
Right.
because when
Which
you're
tends to happen.
especially in a partnership, right? If you're in a
Right.
marriage and you're not taking accountability and you're not saying you're sorry for something, you're in essence blaming the other person. That's what you're doing, right?
Exactly.
And so I
Right.
know my wife and I have always been proactive about a couple things. First of all, if if we've done something wrong to our kids, or if we've made a mistake, we actively apologize to them, right?
Absolutely.
We go up to them and say, hey, I am sorry, I was wrong, right? Because we want to teach them that even
Exactly.
parents make mistakes, right? We're admitting our mistakes. And then if we do argue, you know, which happens in in marriages, right? We try to also have them witness the resolution to an extent. Right? They can witness a healthy debate argument between two people who love each other and who effectively either resolve it or just agree to disagree, right?
Right.
But we want to show them that that relationship is a natural, healthy one, right? And so I think it's really very important to be accountable, to be authentic, and to show that and model that for our kids, because then they will then go seek that healthy relationship, hopefully themselves.
So true. Oh, that is such a good point in front of your kids because they're watching everything.
Yeah,
Every
If
move.
you're a blamer, you know, if everything you do, you blame the other person, that's what they're going to do.
yeah.
That's who they're going to be. So
I always joke our kids do not do what we say; they do what we do.
it's
Right?
It's
I mean,
so
we
true.
can
Show
say
them.
things till we're blue in the face, and they won't even listen, right? But they will do what we do.
they're
Yeah,
watching.
they're watching all the time.
They're
Yeah,
watching.
Yes,
yeah.
they are.
True. Well, tell us where we can find you. Like, go over your book again, and where else can everybody find you?
Yes, I think the best place is theattributes.com, the website. There you can find you can find the book. There, I have the first chapter there if you want to read it. There's an assessment tool that we created, so you can go on the website and take a free assessment to figure out where you stand on the mental acuity attributes, the grit attributes, or the drive attributes. Still working on the leadership team ability ones. We should have those hopefully by the end of the year. Those are a little bit more difficult because while the first two categories can be self-assessed,
Mhm.
because you don't get to call yourself a great leader and because you don't get to call yourself a great teammate, those assessment tools have to be 360. So we're designing that now, but you can go at least right now and take those. I have some workbooks on the website that you can grab to help if you want to develop certain attributes, and then you can find me. My Instagram handles on there and the Facebook page and all that stuff. So website's best place. I'm also on Instagram and LinkedIn too. So
Okay.
Thank you so much for coming on. Your book really is amazing. I loved it.
Oh, thank you so much. It means a lot to me to hear that because I, again, I wanted to write something that people really resonated with
Oh yeah,
and resonated with them, and that wasn't too military, but really talked about this idea of behavior, which I'm really fascinated about. So I
absolutely.
appreciate
It's
it.
awesome.
We need a lot more talking, people talking about that, because it's such a huge thing, and it makes such a big difference. And as an author myself, I know writing the book writing process, it's a labor of love. So
Yeah.
you should feel amazing about yourself that you were able to accomplish this, and you hit such great points. So
Good.
we're really excited. We want everyone to go out and get it and read it, and post on Instagram. Like, that's a really good way to spread, believe it or not, help these authors out. When people post my stuff on Instagram, it's great. And
Yeah.
so if you guys read Rich's book and you like it, post it, put it in your story, share it, like, tell people about it, because people need to hear this stuff. This stuff is important.
It's good.
Well, thank you. Appreciate that. I appreciate both of you. So, and thank you for
Yes.
having me.
Absolutely. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for listening. Have a great day. All right.
All right.
Okay.
Thanks so much. That was so great.
Yeah. Thank you. Where are both of you located, by the way?
I'm in Michigan.
Oh, okay.
Florida.
Oh, okay. So opposites.
Polar.
I'm in between.
Opposite.
I'm in between you two because I'm in Virginia Beach. So yeah.
Oh,
Okay.
nice.
Yeah. So I got it's a nice day here today. But
Oh, I know. Same here. It's finally warm. We get like a good 3 months
right. Yeah. And you're starting to get into it. Whereas Florida, you got a good year.
all year.
Other
Well, that's not
it's
true,
humid
because
it's humid in the
it's
deep
so
south.
humid, number one. Number two, it rains every single day in the summer.
That's right.
And so it's kind of hard to make plans, but it rains for like 20 minutes, but like a crazy storm, and then it's normal again.
Yeah. Well, you can plan around that afternoon thunderstorm, right? That's
Yeah.
that's what you do probably. So
Yeah.
well, cool. It's Friday, so have a wonderful weekend, both of
Yes,
you.
you
And,
too.
and keep in touch. If you need anything, just hit me up. So
Oh, thanks, Rich.
All right.
Rich, we really loved this.
Thank you.
Yes.
Good to see you.
Take
Good to
care.
meet both of you. Bye.
You too.
You too. Bye.